whatever I do that for.
Posterity.
Posterity. All right, and then we'll open up the text. Okay. So last week we looked at Yevamo 107. Hold on, just to check what's today's. So we know right now they're on Yevamo 118. Daf Yomi. I don't know if you can see that on the side panel there. So we fell behind again already. That's what happens when you only study once a week. But we're in the general vicinity of where the rest of the Daf Yomi world, this Talmud studiers, are. So, and it was about this question of a betrothed minor girl, a girl who is betrothed young, and specifically if the father or the betrothed, the husband to be die, where does that leave her with chalitza, with the levirate marriage, and what is her options for getting out of it, both as a woman and as a minor, who has limited autonomy. And Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai have different takes. Both seem to be concerned with like the same things. In the end, their values are the same. They want to protect the girl, but they also want to protect the honor of the man, should he accept the marriage or engage in marital relations with this girl and then she refused after, like, will that cause a scandal for him? So they are both concerned with both aspects and want to keep, the community as clean, I guess, as possible. But they have different takes on how to do that. And as usual, Beit Hillel, so this is later than, Hillel and Shammai themselves are dead. This is their student, the schools that have kind of been set up in their names. But as with the rabbis themselves, Hillel and Shammai, the schools of Hillel and Shammai each continue to be Beit Hillel is much more lenient and has, like, the girl can refuse before or after consummation of the marriage. The girl can refuse in his absence or his presence. The girl can refuse basically anytime, anywhere, for any reason. Hillel's very open, and Shammai has a lot more parameters as to when it is appropriate. And that's very typical for them. I know we didn't get through all of 107, but I don't remember how far we got. Yeah, Debbie, go ahead. What's your question?
Which would match more the typical divorce rules of, any woman wanting freedom from any husband as opposed to this particular levirate marriage? Is there a difference?
There is. So we talked about that a little bit last time because it was a little unclear to me as well, because the question, both because it is a levirate marriage, so it's Yevamo in general is not about divorce, it's about chalitza, right? It's about this like little ritual to get around being married. But also because this is the case, this particular daf, we're looking at a minor who was betrothed, and then either the father who made the match or the person she was betrothed to die, and so she's in this like weird limbo space. So it's not really divorce because she may or may not have actually been officially married yet, or been married but not consummated or whatever. Like, she's still young enough that like it's not the same as a fully engaged marriage. And so they're discussing her options for basically annulment as opposed to divorce. So yeah, so it is a little different. although some of the ways, like Beit Hillel just keeps being like, no, she can still refuse. She can still refuse. Like at some point, it's unclear to me, like, then how is it different than a divorce? Like if, they did stand under the wedding canopy, if they did consummate the marriage, if it has, like if all of these other, things have been met, I don't know, then, but he says it's still an annulment. If she's still a minor or whatever, like it's still appropriate for her to just refuse. Yeah. So let's go to, like I said, I don't know how far we got, but I know we didn't finish it. So let's look at, here, where this little squiggle is. So it's a little bit of a new, it's not a whole new Mishnah. This is like a referral back to the Mishnah that they're all talking about the whole time. But it's a little bit of a clean break from whatever they were arguing about before. Which doesn't mean that whatever they were arguing about before was resolved. So it's not like we need to know what came immediately before, because sometimes the Talmud just does that. They're just done talking about that. So here, Beit Shammai Omrim Baal Vechule. So this, wait, am I sharing my, yeah, you can see what I'm looking at. All right. This thing, Vav Chaf Vav Chupchik, that's a abbreviation that means like etc. So he's quoting here. So Beit Shammai said blah blah blah, and so the editors here remind us what it is Beit Shammai said, what's in the etc. from above. Refusal may be directed only at her husband and not her yavam. The yavam is the next of kin that she would be, levirate married to. If she wishes to refuse her yavam, she must perform chalitza, that's the shoe ritual that absolves a levirate marriage, in order to dissolve the levirate bond. But Beit Hillel say that refusal may be directed at her husband or her yavam. Okay, so that's all just the etc. here. Beit Shammai say. So the Gemara is reminding us of the Mishnah that started this whole, they got off on a tangent and then the Stam brought it back. Like, so this is one of those copy paste edit moments where the later editors who didn't have much to add themselves, they were like, okay, we were trying to put together all this material, it got away from us, let's reset. This is the Mishnah. Okay, remember. Now, new thing. So this is Gemara. Amar Rabbi Oshaya. I think it's Gemara. Although it's Rabbi means it's in the land of Israel and not in Babylonia, but it's a later argument. It's post Mishnah. Okay, so Rabbi Oshaya says, "Mima enet lema'amario," that a minor yavama may direct a refusal against the levirate betrothal. The ena mima enet lezikato. But she may not direct a refusal against his levirate bond. So before the Yavam betroths her, she cannot nullify the bond by refusal. So if he, okay, so if they can do the shoe ritual, but she can't refuse it. They have to do the shoe ritual, basically. I think is what it's saying, is that like she can't just nullify it, because if she already accepted the initial betrothal and he dies, she is bound to the next of kin, whether she likes it or not. So she doesn't have to actually marry him, but she can't annul it or nullify it. She has to do chalitza. Rav Chisda says, "My ta'ama de Rabbi Yoshaya." What is Rabbi Yoshaya's reasoning for this? Me'amar demida ata matya akra. Because in the case of a levirate betrothal, which is consensual, she can nullify it. But with regard to the levirate bond, which applies to her even against her will, she cannot nullify it.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can explain that to us, Rabbi Liz?
Okay, yeah. So the difference, I think it's actually a problem in the English more than in the, not that I understand the Aramaic well enough to know this, but I think the problem is the bond versus betrothal. So I'm thinking about it, you guys are gonna laugh, but honestly, what's helping me make this separation here between betrothal and bond is they're talking about bond in this like almost like existential way. So okay, so in YA fairy books, maybe in fairy lore in general, I don't know how deep this goes, there is like a mating bond that goes beyond like falling in love or whatever, that there is like every fairy or every fae has a soulmate out there, and when they meet, the bond like falls into place. And even if they don't really like each other and they can choose to not be together, but there is like this thread that connects them. So that's sort of what's going on here, is that like if she accepted the betrothal to the first husband and he dies, that bond like moves to his next of kin, whether she likes it or not. That is the bond, as opposed to betrothal, which would be if he says, I accept this. Like if he doesn't want to do chalitza and he wants to actually accept the marriage, that's betrothal. And she can refuse that. She can say, no, I don't consent to be married to you. And then they have to do chalitza. But so that's the difference. That's where the divide between bond and betrothal comes in, that she is bound to him through this other betrothal, but he has to, or they both have to take the next step to also accept a betrothal between the two of them, or to do this chalitza ceremony to dissolve the betrothal, to divorce, essentially. I mean, it's not the same, there's no get, but like to sever it. Yes.
I just before this class, I read your notes, and it was, I think, in the Torah that describes this, the bond to begin with, and it kind of left no room for, it just said she will marry her husband's next of kin. She will. It had no out. So it sounds like they're trying to give them an out by moving it from the bond to the betrothal, and then she can refuse the betrothal, even though the Torah says that she can't receive that thread and from fairyland is holding them together. Something like that.
Right. Yes, that's 100. And because also in the Torah we see, Torah, when Tamar, the first Tamar, the Torah Tamar, there are two big Tamars in the Tanakh, but in Genesis, Judah, one of Joseph's brothers, Tamar marries his oldest son and he dies. So then Tamar does a levirate marriage to the second son and he dies. And so then Judah says, I'm not giving you any more of my sons. And she tricks Judah himself into impregnating her because she's like, I deserve a baby from the line of Israel. Like that's how the bond works. Nobody is off the hook here until I have the baby. And it's, messy. So then, that's part of like, then, okay, so we have to come up with these other rules to help
Okay.
let people off the hook, because otherwise it's messy. And maybe she's a black widow and she just keeps killing men off of the same family, or, whatever the issue is. So, okay. So that's the end of that side of the page, but it is not the end of the argument. It's just where they ran out of room on the sheaf of paper itself. So here we go, right on to side bet. The hare bi'a div al kurcha. The Gemara asks, but the consummation of the Levirate bond may be against her will. Umatzya akara, but she can still nullify it, as she can subsequently refuse the Yavam with whom she entered into the Levirate marriage. So this goes back to the previous argument about, I think this is presuming then that we're still on the case of a minor. So even if she doesn't do chalitza right away because she's young and doesn't really know what's going on, she can still refuse him after this new marriage is consummated. I guess that's where they landed. Last we read, there was a lot of back and forth. And some, this is how that's how Talmud works sometimes, is that it's not entirely clear where they landed until the Gemara says, like, oh, remember, we already decided. And you're like, no, you didn't tell us what you decided. But the Gemara is 300 years after the Mishnah, so whatever's been the practice is they're like, yeah, that's how we landed on that, but it didn't necessarily get written down in the Mishnah. Anyway, so that's where we are. So ele bi'a uma amar, rather the reasoning is dehu ka'aved matzya akara, with regard to the consummation of the Levirate marriage and to the Levirate betrothal, both of which he performs, the Yavam performs, she can nullify them. Zika derachamana rama Allah lo matzya akara. But with regard to the Levirate bond, which the merciful one imposes upon her at the death of her first husband, she cannot nullify it, right? So there's that. They're invoking God here to make sure you understand. The bond, upon the death of the first husband, that's it. That bond locks into place by divine will. There has to be a severing, a very visceral, the ceremony, the whole thing. She cannot just say, no, there's no bond. There is a bond. She has to say, I refuse this marriage. That's the difference. Ula amar mema'enet af lezikato. Ula says she may direct her refusal even to his Levirate bond. What, Ula? What are you talking about? My Tama, why is Ula saying this crazy business? Nisue kama'e ka'akara. By refusing, she nullifies the original marriage rather than the Levirate bond that resulted from the death of her husband. So Ula is sort of invoking Beit Hillel, who says, he didn't say this directly, that after the death of the husband, she can still nullify that original marriage. But Hillel does say that she can nullify even after the first marriage has been consummated, and that she can nullify even in his absence. So I thought that meant she can nullify to his agent, but Ula seems to be saying, no, in his eternal absence. she can also still nullify that marriage. And thus, if she says, you married me off when I was a minor, I never wanted to be married to that guy, so I don't accept this bond, I'm not really married to him, I'm not married to his brother, I reject all of this. Ula is in defense of that, which is like pretty radical, I think. Etive Rabba Ula. Rava is not having it. Ula, what are you talking about? It was taught in a Baraita, Kol sheyachola lema'en velo ne'ana sarata choletzet velo mitya bemet. In any case of levirate marriage in which a minor girl is forbidden to the yavam, she could perform refusal. Oh, and she could perform refusal, but does not perform refusal. Whoa, okay. Her rival wife performs chalitza and may not enter into levirate marriage. I'm not sure who the rival wife is here, where she came from. I need more context here. Is there? No, none of these commentaries are in English. Okay, well, let's read on and see if it becomes clear. Rava continues. Ve'amai Tima'ain hashta v'ti'ak rinhu v'nisue kamai v'tita yabem sarata. Let her perform refusal now and nullify the first marriage retroactively, so that the so-called rival wife was never really a rival wife of a forbidden relative at all, and let her rival wife enter into the levirate marriage. Okay, so I think the rival wife, this is if a man has a wife already, and the minor girl is the second wife, and the husband dies. The minor girl, they're saying not only can she, but like maybe she should retroactively nullify the first marriage. Say, I'm still a minor, I reject this marriage, and then let the first wife be the levirate wife of the new husband, of the yavam, and then the second one doesn't have to do chalitza. Or vice versa. That if the minor chooses to accept the yavam, then the rival wife does need to perform chalitza. But it seems like if the rival wife wanted the yavam, she should have precedence. Like if she came first and she's an adult and she wants that baby of that line, she should have first dibs on the yavam. So I think that's why they're saying let her perform refusal now and nullify the marriage retroactively. But yeah, did I see a hand, Terry or Debbie?
No.
Yeah,
Yeah, David.
if his first wife was there and the new rival or the new wife, the minor or whatever she is, if they don't refuse, are they both then transferred to the brother or whatever on the death of the original man, or what happens?
That's a good question. Let's see if the Gemara answers it. The Gemara answers, a rival wife of a forbidden relative is different due to a rabbinic decree. As Rame Bar Yachezkel taught, in a Baraita, a minor girl who refuses her husband is permitted to his father because the marriage was annulled and she is no longer his daughter-in-law. But one who refuses a yavam is forbidden to his father. So okay, I see what they're saying by forbidden marriage here. It's not just because she's a minor. They're talking about in Leviticus, amongst the list of rules, it includes in-laws, not to however it sees, gaze upon the however it's phrased, gaze upon the nakedness of your husband's father or whatever. But if that's the next of kin, it is allowed if she but she has to annul the first marriage. But then it's not really a yavam because she's annulled the first marriage. This is where, so sometimes Talmud just gets really in the weeds, you know? Alma, bishat nifila nir'et kechalato hacha name, bishat nifila nir'et k'tzarat bito. Evidently, at the time when she happens, before her yavam for levirate marriage, she appears to be his father's daughter-in-law. Since people would not understand that her refusal later on would annul her first marriage, sages decreed that the father-in-law may no longer marry her. Here too, in a case, for example, of the rival wife of a girl who was married to her uncle, since at the time she happened before the girl's father for levirate marriage, she appears to be his daughter's rival wife. Okay, wait, I have to reread that. Here too, in a case, for example, of the rival wife of a girl who is married to her uncle, since at the time she happened before the girl's father for levirate marriage, she appears to be his daughter's rival wife. The sages decreed that even if the girl refuses her original marriage, the rival wife is forbidden to the girl's father. Okay, wait. So this is specifically, I think now they're talking about like, you know, shtetl life, everybody's related to each other. So say there's like overlapping family lines such that in the original marriage, neither wife nor the man are related, but then through like whatever uncle's marriage, whatever, now we're getting into it's too close for either the girl or the rival wife to marry the next of kin. And so that will be a deciding factor in who does levirate and who does chalitza. I suppose then, so it's not, they don't say, but since we're talking only about the forbidden, you know, the relations here, I guess it is implied that if everybody was, you know, say both women came from entirely different geographies and nobody was forbidden to each other, and maybe, you know, and let's say also the next of male kin was not the father, like was also, you know, a cousin or whatever, then yeah, I think both wives could be transferred to, if they both wanted to be, you know, if they both performed the levirate marriage and nobody involved wanted chalitza, I think it looks like they could. But that's a lot of ifs, right? Like if all three parties agree, if none of them have like overlapping family lines that would make it forbidden, if, you know, but if all of those pieces are in place, I think yes, to answer your question, David. That's what I'm getting from this. There's a lot of implied, and that's part of what's like why Talmud is important and interesting and also not conclusive or like not legally binding, because so much of halacha is implied, and then it becomes like, well, what just ended up being accepted? Like where did people kind of land practically on this, and that's what's written down in the later codes, is like just what people ended up doing. Because a lot of, and it will be things that are based on these arguments, but not necessarily, you know, almost never does the Talmud just tell us anything clearly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dave.
Of all of these documents,
Yeah.
is there one that I want to say trumps, but I don't want to say it. The others, like, what's the go-to? Is there a go-to?
That's a hard question. Is there a go-to? Probably Shulchan Aruch is the main go-to, especially with the Mappa. So that the Shulchan Aruch is I want to say 16th century codes written by Joseph Caro. And the Mappa was Joseph Caro was a Sephardic Jew, and the Mappa was the gloss written by an Ashkenazi Jew, where he just kind of says like, this is not really an option for us because we, you know, like the most famous part is like where Shulchan Aruch discusses Passover kashrut, and the Mappa says like, well, you know, we also don't eat XYZ because that's our main starch or carb anyway. So like, that's what we also give up during, you know, when we give up chametz. Like that's the kitniyot stuff is in Shulchan Aruch. So that's, and it's like well organized. It's not crazy long. It's got footnotes so that you know where to refer to previous documents, at least in the English versions. So you know where to refer to. So that tends to be, but it's still like, there's really no end all be all.
Okay.
Because again, like, first of all, like there's just, time marches on, right? So 16,
Yeah.
like there's still more halakha to be derived since then. And like it just, there's, besides the fact of progress and technology and all of those things that can influence halakha, life is so varied. You couldn't possibly account for every situation, you know, if you sat down to think about like, this is the law, like how could you plan for every
Can't.
variation? So that's why then there continues to be responsa and all these other things that help, as questions arise, help us decide. And then you can go back to Shulchan Aruch and you can trace it back through the footnotes, like where have relevant topics also been discussed that we can kind of look to and derive from there. So like if you recall, when we looked at responsa and like in the reform movement especially, or we looked at the reform movement especially, how it kind of does that, where like there's an answer, and of course the reform responsa is very not binding because we just don't like believe in that kind of thing, but it will say like, this is what we recommend or what we believe to be the correct like compromise between traditional halakha and the world as we know it now, and it will kind of land you there, and they'll give you sources. Conservative responsa is even more citation filled with all of this kind of rabbinic stuff, because they are much more concerned with a halachically sound binding decision. And to be honest, I haven't really looked at any modern, or at least not that I can think of, modern Orthodox responsa. Obviously, I've looked at, I mean, when we read responsa traditionally, we're looking at like late Middle Ages to, I don't know, the 1850s. Like that's what a lot of what we studied in the responsa class in rabbinical school.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know how different it looks now.
That was bringing in the responsa really was helpful to me, because, I was just thinking in our own history over the last, say, 50 years, how much has changed culturally and what's acceptable. So thinking about there being 300 years, I'm just trying to figure out how this all hangs together and how is it used today. And that's where the responsa kind of fit for me.
Yeah. Well, and the question of how it all hangs together or is used today is also a varied one, because, so for example, Yevamot is about such an archaic thing. The whole tractate, I mean, not all of it's about minor girls and like where their autonomy begins. That's this, I think we jumped in at a particularly difficult place, but the whole tractate is about chalitza and levirate marriage and this thing that like is not practiced anymore and is a little weird by our modern sensibilities, is like kind of gross, and like, all of these, so it's been very difficult for a lot of people. Like I said, I'm still in a bunch of Daf Yomi Facebook groups and stuff that have been posting about like, this is so weird, this is so uncomfortable, why, like, and all of these men talking about, women's autonomy. It's maybe more relevant now than we would like for it to be, but it's, in the context of the Talmud, like, just these men that didn't even really spend time with their wives, right? Like they were in the study house with other men all the time. They have no idea. And a lot of them had arranged marriages too. So like, what do they really know about autonomy and whatever and love? So it's a really difficult tractate to get through, I think, and to find like that comment or that current relevance, and to be like, what new adaptation of halakha could we even derive from this when we've done away with this concept entirely?
Mhm.
So like, it's not always super clear like that, but then there are parts that like is a pretty direct chain, like from, we were looking at barachot in the beginning and looking at the foundations of our prayer service as we know it, and like, how times of day have been divided up, and like that's changed hugely because of trains, which is like a fun little fact that time as we know it was set for train schedules. But but the general concept of like times of day and when it is appropriate to get up and say your prayers, and then you have to go to work, and when it is time for a break, and like all of these things that are talked about in brachot, and all of it, I don't know, it's just like, it is still very relevant, and it's still interesting to look at the development of our prayer book from those initial, first
Okay.
stages of the Mishnah, of like, you get up and you say the Shema twice a day, and then, oh, there's the Shema and its blessings, and then, oh, there's the Amidah you say 3 times a day, and it kind of, even within the Gemara itself, you see it start to unravel, not unravel, unfold, start to develop. And then our first prayer book, like, written down, is the 9th century, so not too long after the Talmud's finished. And then, and then prayer books as we know it have been pretty much set for 1,000 years. With some changes in the Reform prayer book, we, more of whatever the lingua franca, the language of the place is less Hebrew, more translation, transliteration, whatever are really the biggest differences in prayer books now from 1,000 years ago.
That's also really helpful to see how this all comes together, to really understand the etiology
Yeah,
of where we are now. Thank you.
you're welcome. Yeah, Debbie.
Do any of the ultra-Orthodox communities still do levirate marriage? I mean, assuming that they're not already married, which wouldn't work. Or do you know if any of them do?
To my knowledge, no. As I believe, I can look this up, double check this later, but I don't think anybody still practices levirate marriage, or even feels the need for chalitza.
Did we see a movie about a girl who was asked to marry?
Did we?
Is there a movie out? It just popped into my head, and maybe I saw a movie about a modern day Jewish woman whose husband died or whose fiance died, and she was asked to marry his brother and his brother. It seems to me it's a movie plot, but I'm not sure. It would make a good movie.
Would. Maybe. Let's see. Levirate marriage movie. Loving
They-
Leia, 2009 film.
Okay.
Check
Yeah.
that out.
What was it called?
Loving Leia or Leah. Is it an Israeli movie? Oh, Hallmark. It's a Hallmark movie.
Oh my goodness.
With Ricky Lake. And Lauren Ambrose, isn't she in the Golem movie? That terrible horror film? Oh, okay. And I also just double checked. Levirate marriage, according to the Jerusalem Post, rabbinical court of Jerusalem says that nobody performs levirate marriage, but some people still require, some ultra-Orthodox communities still require chalitza, which, like, I don't know, like, I get the point of rituals for the sake of rituals and things like that, but, like, if it's not even an option, like, if nobody does levirate, I don't know, then what does the chalitza really mean at that point? Like,
I can see that. I mean, there's a lot about the way some ultra-Orthodox communities get around law bothers me, but I can still see that if you believe in the letter of the law, getting out of it in a legal way is important.
Right.
So
Could the difference be between a minor and a adult woman?
the difference in what?
Chalitza
Yeah.
wouldn't apply to a minor with the levirate, but could apply to an adult woman whose husband passes away. And if that makes no sense, don't spend any time on it.
I think, well, that's the basis of the doc we were looking at, right? Is the difference between a
all right.
minor and an
So-
adult woman, and who needs to do levirate or doesn't. I think in modern Israel, even though, like, as much as the ultra-Orthodox communities are still self-segregated and given a lot of autonomy to behave like they still live in the shtetl, I still think there are, like, age of consent laws, and minor girls are not still married off.
That's good.
Yeah. They might be betrothed, but they're not married until
Right,
they're
right.
18.
and you were talking about some folks in your Facebook groups
Yeah.
objecting to all this. I mean, it had to be men to do this because men were the only people that wrote it. And I think, I mean, they may not have gotten it all right, but I think it's grand that they
Right.
that they considered the rights and or the feelings or whatever they thought they were considering. It's a great step forward, and I'm glad that, I mean, it's a great step forward hundreds of years ago, and it's good to hear that we did this.
Right. We talked about that a little bit last week too, that I think like when you look at a lot of this stuff now, it's still absurd. Like all of these hurdles to allow for a minor girl to refuse this marriage instead of just saying like, don't marry children. But like that was the world in which they lived, and so creating these hurdles to allow an out for the girl like was still progress when you look at it in context. And that's why like that's to me so much of the evidence for why Judaism should continue to be on the front lines of progressive values, because they always have been. But like you can only look, like I said last week, you can only look so far ahead of where your society already is. So like we shouldn't be stuck in what was progressive 1,000 years ago or even 200 years ago. We should still be looking at like, well, what's the next barrier to like full equity and livelihoods for people that needs to be knocked down. And we can do it using halakha and traditional Jewish sources, because there is so much already there that's like about the essential worth of every human being. But also just like the concept itself feels very Jewish to me, in the way if you look at what was said 1,000 years ago in its context, or 2,000 years ago in its context, like even some things in the Bible itself were progressive for their time. Like, so it and then they constructed halakha around that value. So we can continue to just make things up around those values, because that's all the Talmud really is anyway. A good source on that is Elliot Dorff. I think it's his bioethics book. That's the only book of his I've read in its entirety, so it must be that, although I have read other essays by him, so it's possible I picked it up somewhere else. But he talks about that, and he's a very progressive rabbi in the conservative movement, and I don't know if he still is, but he served on their responsa committee for like 15 years. And so his point of view, even though like as a Reform rabbi, I am generally less concerned with something being like halachically rooted or, you know, binding, it does make me feel more like secure when my opinions and values are also
Grounded.
like validated by someone who wants that like more traditional religious framework as well. And so he's really good at bringing all of that together. Rabbi Jill Jacobs does that too in her book, There Shall Be No Needy, but her book is more, and maybe this is true to the Talmud too, like I said, like so much of Talmud is, this is what we already are doing or what we want to be doing, like this is the value we're starting with, let's walk backwards and find the reasoning why this is what God ordained from, you know, like let's pull the Torah verses out of context that we want for this. And so not that she pulls things out of context, but she does do a little bit more of like, these are my politics, and here's like where Judaism supports that. Whereas, which I also love, I mean, I love that book, but she starts a little bit more from like the modern necessity of society, and then where Judaism supports that, whereas he really starts from halakha, and his focus, like I said, since I think it's in the bioethics book, it's a lot more of like the value of life itself and things like modern medicine, gender transition, abortion, organ donation, like that kind of stuff that's like really just about physical well-being. That he you know writes a lot about that, which is I don't know, it just feels so like solid.
Mhm.
Anyway, so that's a little taste of Talmud. If you
So now in 4 weeks, we get it all.
you got it all.
We understand.
We understand that we don't understand.
If you want
And
it,
probably will never understand.
Yeah.
well, and that's why people do it over and over again, right?
Yeah.
Because and why people do it in groups. You can't just read the Talmud.
No.
You study the Talmud and you do it over and over again. So if you enjoyed this, if you're interested in learning more about what the Talmud actually says, I know we did a little bit of that, but mostly we looked at structure and like concepts and timeline and stuff. But if you really want to get into Talmud content more, I do recommend those My Jewish Learning e-newsletters. One of the links on the website that said like that took you to the beginning of Yevamot and kind of gave a framework for what the Levirate marriage laws that they're going to be talking about. That's the My Jewish Learning page, and so from there you can click like send this to my email or whatever, and it'll send you every day. There's no reason to wait another 3.5 years. Like there's the Talmud is not very sequential, so you can do it now and just jump in where we are if you want. Hadar has a good podcast, I guess you could call it a podcast. They record their lectures, so they're full hour lectures, so it's a little much, but it's meant for like lay learners, discussing the daf of the day. I hate to promote anything by Tablet Magazine right now, but they have a daily Talmud podcast that's shorter and more conversational, which I've not listened to, but it seems like it would be very good and accessible for some people, more than the lecture from Hadar. So those are all resources to keep learning this, because just kind of going to Safaria and clicking on the actual text of the day is like you're just going to get a lot more of that, where you're like, what are they talking about?
I think I'll go to the fairy book.
The fairy book. There you go.
But thank you. We have a
Yes.
small book on our shelf by Judith Abrams. I think
Okay.
it's called Beginning Torah. And I've picked it
Talmud.
up Talmud, and I've picked it up a couple times and read a few pages and have never gotten through it. And I might be moved to get further through it now.
Yeah. I bet it's more accessible than Aiden Steinsaltz's Essential Talmud.
The book's only about that. It's not a thick book, so. But thank you for this. That was,
Absolutely. It was an insight into, a whole world.
It
That,
is. It is
Yes.
a whole world. As a Driven Leaf, if you've never read that book, I recommend it.
I have that book, actually.
I find it is on a lot of people's shelves,
Yes.
and yet I never really hear people other than rabbis talk about it. It's a
Uh.
novel, so it's like, it's a little, it's an older book. I found it a little dry when I read it, but it's a novel. It's fun. It's about one of the Mishnah rabbis.
Okay.
The quote-
I'll take it off my shelf.
As a Driven Leaf.
I'll share it with you, Debbie.
Okay.
Anybody else that,
I forget who it's, I probably have it on my shelf here somewhere, but I can't see it right now. So I forget who the author is, but it'll give you more insight into sort of like the world, right? Like, so it's about the Elisha ben Abuya, who becomes a heretic. So it's not only a little bit about the writing of the Mishnah, but then also about the other like proto-Christian sects in Israel at the time, and what everybody else was doing, and what life in Israel in the year 130 or whatever it is.
Milton Steinberg is the author.
Milton Steinberg. There you go. Thank you.
thank
Uncle
you.
Milty.
Uncle Milty, yes.
Yeah,
Good old Milton.
now I know why I never finished it, but I will with a different mindset or parameter.
Yeah. I recommend it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Any other questions about anything?
Have a
I
good
use the
day,
Skype.
Amy, today.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. Bye, everyone. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.